of fur and fear. The wind swirled through a pile of leaves as the old 75 Chevy pickup sped past, at least as much wind as an old truck like it could kick up. It wasn't very well maintained, though it had been at one point. Carol wasn't concerned with its appearance as much as she was its function. Spots of rust marred the truck across the entire surface, none so bad as to keep it from being useful. It still scratched at Dani, Carol's best friend and current passenger, to see the truck slowly falling to ruin. The two rode on through the cool fall day, across worn-out blacktop. They weaved their way through the countryside, over and around potholes, winding deeper and deeper into the heart of the Appalachians. They were heading to Carol's grandfather's cabin, tucked away in a valley just off the beaten path. But their journey was just as important to the two as their destination. Normally they would sing together to classic rock ballads from the 80s and 90s, some punk, and occasionally some pop music. Their voices would compete with the speakers, startling any pedestrians as they passed by. But this trip was a little different. The leaves were changing. Their morose browns and oranges filled one's vision no matter where they looked. The beautiful colors of autumn subtly pushing their thoughts towards death. For Carol, the thoughts were more of concern and love for her friend, the colors reminding her of her friend's loss. For her part, Dani was lost in daydreams of times past, pushed by the nostalgia woven between the trees. There was still music, but no singing this time. Carol pulled open the cassette case that sat between them and started thumbing through her collection. "Please watch the road instead of playing with your antique collection," Dani teased. Carol simply grinned at Dani as she found the cassette she wanted. "Don't look, it's a surprise." She kept her hand pressed flat over the spine of the tape until Dani sighed and looked away. Driving with her knees, Carol flipped open the case and popped out the old cartridge. She cranked the volume on the Chevy just in time for Freddie Mercury to shout "bicycle." "Oh, I hate you," Dani grinned at her friend before putting her head in her hands and shaking it back and forth. "I want to ride my bicycle," Carol belted back, waving an arm out wide as she sang along with Mercury. Dani laughed and finally joined in. Though the mood lightened and the air seemed to ease a little, something still felt off. The emotions, the motivation behind this getaway, everything wrong with life and life's problems in general aside, their shoulders still felt a little tense. Something was still off, something more visceral than the tides and torments of life. But, for the moment, they could ignore the slight unease of the stomach and pretend everything was fine. "Are you sure this is the right road?" Dani asked. "I'm certain," Carol replied, her tone giving away the lie. "I came here at least once before, and once is all it takes for me to remember my way." She winked at Dani. "Really?" Dani arched an eyebrow. "Then why did we get lost so easily coming back from Charlotte? And wasn't that the 6th or 7th time we'd been there?" Details, Carol chided. "You seem to forget I had a few drinks while celebrating with our friend Mary Jane. I'm stone sober right now, as sad as that is, so we're fine." She looked over at Dani. "We're fine," she said a little more softly, reaching over to rub her friend's shoulder. "I promise I know where we're going. It's just further off the road than I thought." They had left from Carol's apartment at 8 in the morning. The plan was to go spend a weekend away from everything, leave their phones, computers, everything that could connect them to the larger world behind, and spend a weekend just forgetting. Carol had been sure they could reach the cabin by noon. However, the clock was only a few minutes off from 3. Getting lost with Carol wasn't unusual, but rarely were they ever lost for more than an hour. 3 hours off the mark had Dani really concerned. "Maybe we should turn back," Dani suggested. "It's just a little further," Carol said. "I don't know," Dani sighed. "Something just feels off." Dani chewed her lower lip. The woods, once beautiful before, now looked ominous in the shady valley they traveled. They hadn't passed a single house in a long time, much less a service station. "How much gas do you have left?" Carol looked down, then back up quickly. "Enough." Her voice was quiet. She glanced over to find Dani glaring at her behind her black-rimmed glasses, between the long, dark strands of hair that had fallen in front of her face. "Enough," Carol insisted. "Carol," Dani said. Okay. Carol let out a breath. "We'll drive another 10 minutes, and if we don't see the turnoff, we'll go back. We'll still have enough to make it back to the last station we saw." if I include the extra I have in the can. Both women faced forward, the tension of the cab palpable. Neither really wanted to give up on their trip, but they also didn't want to be stranded in the middle of nowhere. Though, if they were honest, setting an endpoint to their wandering had eased a bit of tension that had been building in them for the last few hours. The promise of escape unwound the wire a bit. Then the gate appeared. "There it is!" Carol shouted, letting go of the wheel long enough to clap her hands. As she slowed down, she looked over at Dani. "I told you we were getting close." "You know, it's easy to be right if you predict the same thing for 3 hours straight." Dani gave her friend a weak smile. "Ouch!" Carol laughed as she brought the truck to a stop. "Mind grabbing the gate?" She opened the glove compartment and pulled out a key ring that held only 3 keys. She selected the small silver one. "This is the one. It'll open a padlock on the right side." "No problem," Dani said, taking the key and stepping out of the truck. She took a moment to stretch her back and legs, easing the pain that builds after any long trip. The gate was set at the bottom of a gentle hill, blocking access to a gravel road that stretched off into the distance. Both sides of the road, despite the onset of fall, were still shrouded in the shrubbery that pops up deep in the woods. The curtain of autumnal leaves and deep forest bushes made the road look like a mystical passage cutting from the present to the past. Dani stepped up beside the gate and noticed the lock held a small latch on the interior side of the gate from being released. She threaded her arms through the gaps in the gate and started working to get the key into the lock. She felt the key slide home and click into place, and with a little effort she could wiggle the lock free and release the gate. As she opened it to start walking it across the path, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand. She moved across the road, holding the gate, but started looking around. She couldn't see anything, but the sensation of being watched was strong. "Don't worry about latching it back completely," Carol called to her as she moved the truck through the opening. Hurrying, Dani closed the gate and threaded the lock into place, but left it unlocked. She hopped back in the cab at the truck and shuddered. "Is there anything out in the woods around here?" she asked. "Come on, honey," Carol said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Yes, of course. Lions, griffins, dragons, all sorts of nasty beasts we don't have back home." "You know what I meant," Dani snapped back. "Nothing worse than what we have back home," Carol said. "These are the same mountains, just a little further north." "All right." Dani rubbed her arms, still scanning the woods as the truck moved up the road. She hesitated mid-admission. "I just felt like I was being watched while I opened the gate." "That was just me watching your sweet ass walk across the road." Carol winked at her. Dani smiled and punched her friend in the arm. "Seriously," Carol said. "You'll feel like that out here, at least occasionally. And odds are good something is actually watching." Carol held up her hand to forestall Dani's interruption. "But watch is pretty much all anything does. There's some bears, cats, and coyotes around. However, they'll leave us alone as long as we're noisy enough." "We'll be safe with you at night, then," Dani said, then started imitating a loud snore. "Ha, ha, ha," Carol replied. "Well, at least I'll actually be asleep." "Are we going to have enough gas to get home by the time this road ends?" Dani asked. "Once again, there's a 5-gallon container in the back. That'll give us enough to at least make it—" Dani cut in and finished the sentence for Carol. "Back to the station from before. Yeah, I remember. I just like being reminded." The road went up for a 1/4 of a mile past the gate, then dropped and started curving along the ridge line of the mountain. They followed the road through winding curves, hills, and drops for another 20 minutes before it stopped right in front of an old log cabin. A bright smile passed across Carol's face as she jumped out of the truck and strode forward to stand in front of the cabin. "Welcome to Le Chateau de Wilkes," she claimed, spreading her arms wide. Dani took a moment to let everything sink in. The cabin sat in the middle of a small clearing, the trees having been pushed back long ago. The gutters were filled with leaves, spider webs matted the windows on the outside, and there were several spots that could use some attention, but it seemed to be in shockingly good condition. There were no cracks in any of the wood, the roof was very clearly intact. The chairs and swing on the porch didn't seem any worse for wear. Hell, even their chains seemed to be rust-free. "I thought you said no one had been here in years," Dani asked. "They haven't." Carol turned around, looking the cabin over for herself. "It's just really well built." She turned and walked back towards the truck. "Come on, Let's get our stuff and get it inside. I'd like to finish unpacking so we can take a walk through the woods before dark. Carol's excitement was infectious, and soon enough Dani felt her apprehension recede. She started grabbing her bags out of the bed of the truck. Even feeding off Carol's enthusiasm, she kept sending glances back to the woods. She had never stopped feeling as if eyes were on her. The cabin interior was pervaded by the musty smell of a building left unused. Other than the smell, though, it was spotless. The living room had 2 small couches perched around a fireplace that held an old steel fire dog. Only small splotches of blackened brick even hinted that it had ever been used. A kerosene lamp hung from the ceiling, decorated with a small golden filigree that showed it was meant to be a permanent fixture. Off from the main room were 2 bedrooms, each cozy but not necessarily small, a kitchen fitted with an old wood stove, a sink operated via pump, and a small table with seats for 3. Oddly enough, the kitchen also contained quite an array of knives. They were stationed in small holding blocks, but there were 4 blocks, each with their own variety and sizes of knife. In the center of the kitchen was a trap door that led to a cellar of some sort. I wonder what's down there, Carol pondered. Probably spiders, snakes, and other nasty things, Dani replied. Let's keep our sense of adventure outside. She moved around Carol and put a bag containing some groceries on the kitchen counter. They hadn't brought anything that required refrigerating. Fortunately, Carol had remembered that the cabin didn't have electricity, but they had brought a wide variety of fruits, vegetables, and canned goods, and, of course, a couple bottles of good liquor. Come on, aren't you at least a little curious? Carol asked. Nope, Dani replied. Not the least bit. Not about what lies beneath the building we're sleeping in. Carol whined along behind Dani as she put supplies in the cabinet, less focused on her friend's whining than puzzled by the lack of dust inside the cabinets. She turned around and faced her friend. Are you certain no one has been here in many, many years? Certain. Who else would come? Carol said. It was Papa's. He didn't have any other family besides Mom and myself. Why would anyone else ever come here? It's just so clean, Dani said. I told you, Carol said, taking her friend's hand and leading the way towards the door. It's really old, but really well built. Everything inside keeps very well. You know that doesn't make any sense, Dani said, letting herself be steered along. It doesn't have to, Carol said, stopping and turning around to face Dani. Forget about it. Let's just go exploring. Since you won't let me dig around in here, we've got to wander around out there. Carol waved a hand towards the door. Dani realized for the first time that she hadn't felt like she was being watched since they stepped inside the cabin. Suddenly, letting Carol explore the cellar didn't seem like such a bad idea. Did you bring anything with you for protection? Condoms? Carol turned towards Dani, a puzzled look on her face. Why would we need those? Dani couldn't help but laugh at her friend. Never mind. She started out the door, back into the cool fall air. Seriously, why would we need condoms? Carol asked again, following close behind. I meant a gun, pepper spray, something along those lines, Dani said through her laughter. Oh, Carol replied. I thought... Never mind what I thought. No, I didn't bring anything like that. Why would I? We're in the middle of nowhere. Neither woman was particularly big. As a matter of fact, both were rather small of stature. They both wore blue jeans and long-sleeved plaid shirts over top smaller undershirts. Just enough layers to stave off the bite of the wind, but not so much to overheat. The air was cool and crisp, but the last fangs of summer hadn't quite been torn away yet, so the days were still cool, but potentially warm, while the nights could be downright cold. Even wearing layers, though, the women grabbed their light overcoats from the truck, as well as a flashlight just in case they didn't make it back before full dark. We've only got about an hour before we need to turn back, Dani said. I know, Mom, Carol said. Did you wash behind your ears this morning? Dani took on a parental tone. Screw you, and of course I did, Carol replied. They set off down an old trail that led away from the cabin and the road, plunging deeper into the mountains. The trail followed along the banks of a small, dry creek bed, winding its way slightly uphill, but following in the cleft of a valley between the 2 larger mountains to either side. Leaves crunched underfoot, but the path wasn't overgrown. Shrubs, trees, and what few other plants were still alive hadn't started reclaiming the trail. I wonder what uses this path to keep it so clear of plants, Carol asked. Well, you see, Dani replied, it's just so old and well built it maintains itself. Carol gave Dani a shove, but they kept walking. The trees closed in overhead, thinning out the already dimming light, but creating a beautiful pergola of gently overlapping branches, their tips barely touching, as if feeling the presence of their neighbor was enough. They watched as crows danced from limb to limb, even spotting a deer ahead of them at one point. Of course, nothing else showed up once they started being trailed by a chipmunk determined to announce their presence to anything and everything in sight. "I need a rock," Carol said. "Why?" Dani asked. "To shut that little fucker up," she replied, bending over to scrape away leaves as she looked to see what she could find on the trail. "Come on, leave him alone," Dani said. "He's just doing what he does. He'll go away eventually." "If he'd stopped that damn barking, I wouldn't care," Carol said. "But I want to see more than just him. Help me find something." Dani started helping move leaves around, helping Carol look for a rock. They were making a lot of noise on their own, swishing, crunching, and crashing as leaves flew from left to right to reveal the bare earth beneath. Slowly, something dawned on Dani. "Carol, stop for a second." Carol kept brushing the leaves aside. She had moved a few feet from the trail towards the creek bed. "Carol, stop." Carol paused in her tracks. "What?" she asked. "Listen," Dani said. No noises were being made. The chipmunk had left, but so had everything else. Carol smiled. "Great, he's gone." She stood up and dusted her hands off on her jeans. Dani stood up slowly, put a hand on her friend's shoulder to stop her from moving around. "Shouldn't there be some noise, though? Birds or anything else?" They both stood silent. Several moments passed, with only the sound of their heartbeats in their chest, and their breath slowly pushing through their bodies, giving life to the scenery. They turned, looking around them, trying to find some signs of life. "Maybe it's time we went back," Dani suggested. "I have no problem with..." Carol stopped talking and took a few steps forward. She was gazing off in the distance, squinting to see in the failing light. "What is that?" she asked, and pointed further up the trail. Dani stepped up beside her friend and looked in the direction she was pointing. She didn't notice anything at first. As her eyes adjusted, she noticed a black blob that seemed to slowly be getting bigger. "I have no idea." She pulled the flashlight out of her pocket. She didn't think it'd do any good at this distance, but she decided to try. She barely noticed the light it cast out, any more than a few feet in front of her. "Let's just go, and let's be fast." She turned and started back down the trail. "All right." Carol stepped up beside her and took Dani's hand. Despite her teasing Dani by calling her mom, Carol really did seem to take some solace from her friend in a very maternal way. Dani made Carol feel safer, more like she could let loose and be herself, knowing her friend would keep her from stepping too far over the edge. Dani kept glancing back, watching the spot where the blob had been. She was feeling nervous, and anywhere else she would have jogged back to the cabin. She didn't know this trail, though, and knew the footing was unsafe. Some time passed and nothing happened, but the unease just wouldn't leave. Both women were constantly checking over their shoulder, especially after a few turns obliterated their line of sight with whatever had been casting the shadow behind them. They turned a corner, and there stood the cabin. The last vestiges of light were fading quickly, but they were only a few hundred yards away from safety. They picked up their pace, neither running, but both anxious to feel the sweet embrace of the shelter. Then, a roar and the crash of brush behind them rattled their world. They turned, and standing at the edge of the curve, just a handful of yards away, was a giant black bear. Despite the incline of the trail, it was easy to see that the beast, even on all fours, stood head and shoulders taller than either of the women. The creature snarled and roared again, froth spraying from its lips, shaking its head side to side. Dani heard Carol scream and felt her hand being wrenched forward as Carol started to run. Dani, pulled forward by Carol's momentum, took off, but their pace kept accelerating. The roar of crushing leaves and booms from the beast's throat sounded behind them, rapidly gaining speed. Dani risked a glance back, acutely aware of how lucky she had been so far avoiding rocks, but needing to know how far away the monster was. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw it was within 10 feet of her and closing. Even worse, the monster didn't even seem to be running a straight line. It swayed side to side, swinging its head, rushing from left to right, and still gaining on her trail. Her heart thundered in her chest, her lungs burned, but she pushed harder. The front door was only a few feet away. She could make it. She could make it. Carol even had the door ajar, screaming for her to run faster, waving her forward and ready to slam the door shut the second she made it through. Her feet hit the planks of wood that made up the porch. Within 2 steps, one foot was passing across the threshold when she felt a sharp pain in her left arm. She looked down to see the bear's maw gripping her forearm. It had her. A scream tore away from her throat, pain and fear pitching her voice high. Ignoring the pain, she planted her heels and tried to pull herself free. She didn't care if her arm was torn away. Every instinct, every nerve in her body told her that any sacrifice would be better than being taken away by this monstrosity. She started beating at its face with her free hand, and what little blood she had left in her face drained away as the monster started backing up, taking her with it. She started swinging harder, trying to daze it or scare it, hoping she could make it let go, just for a second. A second was all she needed, just enough time to jump back into the cabin. The harder she hit it, though, the harder it bit down. Tears streaming down her face, she felt her knees give out from under her. She kept hitting, but the bear was slowly pulling her away from the cabin, almost carefully dragging her further from the door, further from freedom. Then a flash of silver, and red bloomed across the bear's face. It released her arm and roared in agony. Dani felt something grab her shoulder and begin to drag her towards the doorway again. She looked over her shoulder and felt a fresh wave of tears of joy wash down her face as she saw Carol pulling her inside, a knife clutched in the hand not gripping her shoulder. Dani stood and the two of them rushed inside and slammed the door shut. In a panic, they started to bar the door, dragging what little bit of furniture that was inside against it. After a few moments, the two were standing, catching their breath, when Dani started to sway a little. "Oh shit, your arm!" Carol grabbed Dani's arm and lifted it up to look at the wound. Dani nervously looked down at the wounds herself. They really weren't as bad as she expected, but she expected to see flesh sheared away from bone, merely rags of her old arm left behind. Instead, there was plenty of blood, but there was only a handful of deep, circular holes. "It's not so bad." Dani tentatively probed the flesh around the holes. Sharp pains ran up her arm, but it really didn't hurt as much as she thought it should. "I just need to sit down for a bit." "We've got to clean that and get it wrapped up," Carol said. "You sit down. I'll find something we can use." She wandered off into the kitchen. Dani could hear her digging through drawers, throwing their contents aside, slamming empty ones shut. Her arm throbbed, but with each passing heartbeat, the sounds all seemed to die down a little. The pain started feeling distant, and she became fascinated with the mortar between the logs on the wall. What was, in the daylight, a burnt red, was gaining streaks of black. The black seeped from the logs into the mortar, traveling like veins grown wildly across the flesh of the building. The colors of the wood slowly leaching, the black spreading like corruption through blood vessels. A hand coming to rest on her shoulder pulled her out of her reverie. "Here, hold this." Carol handed Dani an old shirt Carol had brought with her. "We'll have to make do for now." Carol walked back to the kitchen, but returned seconds later holding a knife. She sat on the floor in front of Dani and went to work on the shirt, ripping the cotton tee apart into bandages. "I left my first aid kit in the truck." Her voice trailed off as she started using some Jack Daniels and a piece of the shirt to clean off Dani's wounds. "I didn't think we wouldn't be able to go out and get it." She began wrapping Dani's arm, ignoring being gentle to be practical. "This will feel a little tight at first, but we've got to stop the bleeding." Dani, at that moment, was thankful Carol was a nurse. "I'm going to go down into the cellar and see if there is, by any miracle, something stored down there that we can use." Carol set the knife on the floor, stood and walked back to the kitchen. Dani noticed that the odd colors of the walls were still there. Carol grabbed the handle of the cellar door and pulled. The damn thing was stuck on something, but Carol couldn't quite tell what. On a whim, she grabbed another knife off the counter and started running it along the edges of the trapdoor. Surprisingly, she felt the sensation of paper tearing. After running the knife along all 4 sides of the trapdoor, she put the knife on the counter, then tried again. This time, it lifted free of its resting place easily enough. The first thing to greet her was the stench of old vegetative rot. The stench was so strong it made her take a step back, coughing. She regained her composure quickly and grabbed a flashlight off the nearby table. She was happy to see steps, and not a ladder, leading down into the cellar. Cautiously, she made her descent. The steps were made of stone, seemingly solid pieces. Not cement, but actual stones carved into steps. The walls were entirely earthen, and the stairwell seemed to follow a narrow passage. It didn't take long to reach the bottom, but standing in the doorway, shock-locked Carol's feet still. The stairs led into a room with shelves lining the walls. Old jars, covered in dust and filled with fluids of some sort she didn't recognize, were scattered across them all. But most disturbing was the weird black symbols painted over everything. She traced her flashlight across the ceiling of the room, back over the ceiling of the stairwell, and up to where the trap door had been. The symbols covered every square inch. She felt she now knew what she had cut through to open the cellar door. The place seemed like some weird combination of a science lab and a cult sacrificial chamber. It didn't take her long to decide she wasn't going to find anything of worth down here. She didn't even feel like searching the entire chamber. She turned to leave and must have caught her arm on a loose nail in the doorframe because she felt a line of fire burn across her shoulder. She sucked in a breath and looked down. Fortunately, she had only received a small cut. There was a little blood, but not enough to be worth worrying about. She climbed back up the steps, taking them two at a time, and happily slammed the trapdoor closed. She walked back to the living room to find Dani up and looking out the window. "See anything interesting?" she asked. Dani raised her uninjured arm and pointed. For some reason, the sharp-toothed fuck has hunkered down out front. Carol looked through the window, and sure enough, the bear was laying on the ground, facing the cabin, just at the edge of the light cast from the kerosene lantern hanging in the living room. "How long do you think he'll stay there?" Carol asked. "You're supposed to be the nature freak," Dani replied. "I don't know. I've never heard of a situation like this," Carol said. "Normally, if they attack, which they don't do often, they'll persist for a little bit, but back off if it seems like they have clearly lost their prey." "He does have us trapped," Dani responded. "He doesn't know that," Carol said. "He's just a dumb bear." The two exchanged a glance and simply stood for a moment, watching the black behemoth biding its time at the edge of the light. "What did you find in the cellar?" Dani asked her after a few moments. "Just some really creepy jars and some really weird writing all over the ceiling," Carol answered. "I don't know what the hell—" She was interrupted by a massive boom as the trap door flew open and slammed into the floor. Both women jumped and instantly had their backs to the front window. A low, piercing cry echoed up from the cellar. Its sound flooded the cabin, causing the walls to vibrate, piercing through the souls of the two women. Carol began to shiver, fear greater than even that which the bear had caused pulsing through her veins with every beat of her heart. Dani, already at the edge, felt despair wash over her. The first thing the women saw were the antlers slowly rise from the hole in the kitchen floor. The creature emerged sluggishly, each step taken as if it were having trouble breaking loose, stiff joints. But it did emerge. By the time it reached the top of the steps, it was clear to the two women that the thing was tall enough for its antlers to scratch the ceiling of the cabin as it walked. The top of its head was nothing but the top half of a deer skull. The bottom half looked like the distended jaw of a man. Its mouth was held partly open, revealing a solid row of tiny, jagged teeth. Over its shoulders draped a white fur. Whether this was merely clothing or furred flesh, neither woman could tell. Its arms were long and slender, turning from solid black at the shoulder to a pallid white at the hands. Those hands, those monstrous hands, contained long, slender fingers tipped with black claws. It was clearly skinny, almost emaciated, and seemed to be wearing an almost rotted sack for clothes over its chest and upper legs. But its eyes drew the most attention. Inside the black cavities of the deer skull burned two globes of red. They shone like lights in a distant darkness, but lights that warned of death and decay instead of hope. It stretched, the joints of its arms, legs, and back popping with wet, slick sounds at each movement. Then it started shambling towards the women. Dani immediately turned and started working at opening the window. "Carol, help me!" she cried. Carol simply stood, staring this walking death in the face, transfixed by the creature's gaze. "Carol!" Dani screamed. She had gotten the window unlatched, but couldn't get it to budge upward. She slapped Carol, hoping to knock some sense back into her. Carol turned and slowly seemed to come back to reality. The monster had covered half the distance between them and the opening in the kitchen, each step limbering it up a little more, making its motions come more smoothly. Carol gripped the window and helped Dani pry it open. Wait! She grabbed her friend's shoulder. What about the bear? Fuck the bear! Dani yelled and started to climb through the window. The gray, pallid hand wrapped around her arm where the bear had bitten her. It was so cold it felt like the heat was being seeped from her flesh. Then her world started to spin. The monster had flung her across the cabin, away from the window. It casually batted Carol to the side. Her body crashed into the cracked wall. She lay crumpled at the wall's base, motionless. The creature placed one hand on top of the window, but before closing it leaned forward. It let out a sound like a cross between a hiss and a laugh through the opening. Its taunt was met with the roar of the bear. The monster slammed the window shut, flicking the lock in place, then bending the latch so it wouldn't open again. Dani was getting her bearings back. She had hit the far wall of the room with her shoulder and been stunned, but not knocked out. As she got to her hands and knees, she saw the creature lean down and grab one of Carol's ankles. It started dragging her towards the kitchen. Dani pushed herself the rest of the way to her feet. Panic clawed at her mind, trying to take control. Only the need to help her friend kept her from losing all calm. She looked around the room, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. She spotted the knife. She bent down and scooped up the knife, then headed back towards the kitchen. The creature had lain Carol across the table and seemed to be rummaging around, looking for something. Dani felt like she wouldn't get another chance to surprise the creature, so she rushed it and plunged the knife deep into its back. The knife penetrated with surprising ease, sliding between ribs and pushing through with little resistance. The creature's head turned to regard Dani as if she were nothing more than an insect. It turned and placed a hand on her shoulder, holding her in place just as much as her fear was. With its long arms, it reached up, over its shoulder, to the middle of its back and pulled the knife free. She didn't see it so much as flinch. It held the knife and studied it for a moment, and then let out those strange hissing laughs she heard earlier. It patted Dani on the head, then backhanded her. She fell to the floor, her vision fading. Dani woke to a pounding headache. She had no idea how long she had been out. She was disoriented and couldn't really remember what had happened. She pushed herself up from the floor, noting she left a bloody handprint on the floor. The wounds on her arm had reopened and were bleeding again. With a start, the memories came flooding back to her. She jumped to her feet and had to pause as a wave of nausea hit her. She realized her ears were ringing, but she could faintly hear something that sounded like screams. She searched the room but saw nothing, no sign of the creature, no sign of Carol, just the open trap door. With each passing second, her senses recovered. She became certain what she was hearing was screaming. Carol screaming. Feeling like she was betraying Carol, she edged her way around the hole and went back to the living room. She started moving everything out from in front of the door. She kept telling herself there was nothing she could do, but this didn't stop the tears from flowing down her face as she worked her way towards her own escape. She got the door unbarricaded, unlocked it, but couldn't make herself turn the knob. She was terrified, absolutely shaken to her core. She knew she couldn't possibly kill the creature. She had stabbed it and it laughed. But she felt like she owed it to Carol to try. She couldn't leave Carol to die alone. She moved back into the kitchen and picked up another knife from the many racks lining the counter. It hadn't helped before, but it still made her feel better than going down into the cellar barehanded. She stood at the lip of the cellar entrance, taking a few deep breaths, steeling herself for what was to come. Slowly, she descended the stairwell, noting a faint glow coming from the doorway at the end. She leaned on the wall as she went, trying to take her weight off each step, hoping it made her quieter. Holding the knife out in front of her, she edged up to the door frame. She took one more breath and peeked around the corner, dreading what she might see going on. The monster had set a kerosene lantern on a small shelf near the entrance, and it cast the uneven light of flame across the scene in front of Dani. The monster had laid her friend on the floor and was crouched over her. It held Carol down with one hand, while the other worked the knife across Carol's upper arm. Carol's legs kicked in time with her screams, her free arm thrashing at the arm pinning her chest to the floor. Her kicking slowed and her screams stopped as the creature stopped sawing. It let her go, and Carol immediately crawled backwards, pushing herself against the closest wall. She wrapped an arm around her legs and started rocking back and forth. Her shoulder was mangled, skin and muscle ripped away in various places. The monster picked up the piece of Carol's flesh it had sawed free and held it out for inspection. Dani felt her stomach twist as the monster lifted the piece into the air and slowly lowered it into its open and eager mouth. The red light of its eyes faded, as if it were closing them to savor the taste of its prize. It chewed slowly, its arms spread slightly, ecstasy inundating it. Rage at the treatment of her friend burned through Dani's veins. She started to step into the room to try stabbing the monster again. Her shoulder brushed the lantern, and she felt its heat. In an instant, she came up with a new idea. She dropped her knife and grabbed the lantern from the shelf. "Hey, you bastard!" she shouted at the monster. Its head swiveled towards her. Its eyes almost seemed to widen in surprise. As it faced her, Dani launched the lantern towards it, throwing it as hard as she could manage, her rage and adrenaline letting her ignore the marks on her arm and the pain in her shoulder. The thing stood as the lantern flew, and the lantern shattered against its chest. The lantern exploded into a fireball, and the monster started to flail around the room, engulfed by fire. Dani ran around the edge of the room to her friend and forced Carol to her feet. As the monster waved its arms, caught by panic and fear, the two slipped around it and ran up the steps. The fire from the monster was slowly spreading, catching the shelves and the ceiling above. The two ran up the stairs, Dani guiding a nearly catatonic Carol. When they reached the top, Dani turned and slammed the cellar door shut, hoping she wouldn't need it to bide them time. They ran towards the door, all thoughts of the bear gone. Even a death to it would be more natural than a death to whatever that thing was. Smoke was starting to fill the cabin, the fire spreading from within, heat bubbling up from the cellar room beneath them. Just as they opened the door, a deep, guttural roar met their ears as the trapdoor was blown to splinters. The monster emerged from the cellar, smoke spiraling up off its burned hide. Its humanoid jaw had been seared clean of flesh. Its clothes burned away, and the fur of its shoulders charred off. Its body was muscular, but oddly human. The creature looked like it had once been human, but was twisted and stretched beyond normal reason. Where the fire had touched the blackened parts of its hide, bones and shadows broke through the broken flesh. The only blood seemed to be seeping from a burn across its stomach. Its steps echoed and shook the floor as it marched towards the women. Dani felt a force push her to the side and pinned her to the wall, and the fleeting sense of carpet ran across her exposed arm. She looked to Carol to find her friend thrown to the floor. The bear had pushed its way between them, and with a roar it launched itself at the monster. The monster roared back and grabbed the bear's shoulders, holding it back, keeping it from wrapping its jaws around the monster's face. The creature's claws dug into the bear's flesh, and the bear's claws ripped at the creature's arms. Dani watched the two Goliaths fight as she slowly moved towards Carol. She helped her friend up from the floor once again, and the two fled the cabin. They could hear the monsters roaring at one another as they fought. Dani helped Carol into the passenger side of the truck, then ran around and jumped into the driver's seat. Carol had left the keys in the ignition, and Dani brought the old Chevy to life. Watching the rearview mirror as she sped down the darkened road, she finally started to see flames engulf the cabin. Even this far away, with the windows closed, she could still hear the roars as the two monsters fought. She hoped they managed to kill each other. Dani had simply driven through the gate when they had reached the end of the gravel road. She had only managed to break one headlight, so she wasn't too worried about the damage to the truck. So far, it had held up well to being pushed to move as fast as it possibly could. Every mile she put between Carol, herself, and the monsters was like shedding years of age. Carol was injured, but she wasn't bleeding too bad. Dani was worried more about her friend's mental state than the state of her body. Once the truck had hit the main road, Carol had lain down in the seat and put her head on Dani's lap. She hadn't spoken a word. Of course, Dani hadn't really tried to talk to her. What could she say? "Hey, so what did you think of being tortured by some monster we found locked in the cellar? Crazy, right?" No, those conversations could come later, either with each other or with a therapist. Probably both, but not right now. Right now it's time just to focus on making it to a hospital. Dani looked down at the gas gauge and nearly cursed. The truck was almost empty. Sometime soon she would have to stop and use the gas from the can in the back. She had rarely driven the truck, so she had no idea how long the truck would continue to run before she had no choice but to stop. They had almost made it completely through the night, their horrifying adventure lasting nearly from dusk till dawn. This time of the year, sunrise should be around 6:45. The clock on the dash read 6. If the truck could make it another 45 minutes, she wouldn't have to get out and refill the tank in the dark. Part of her didn't know if she could make herself get out of the cab without sunlight. She didn't know what would be worse, fighting a freshly budding fear of the dark, or fighting the fear of sitting still only a few hours out from where the monster had attacked them. The clock ticked from 6 to 6:01, and she said a silent prayer.